The sun rose steadily over the horizon, dousing the landscape with light and colour as the Martian warship hung in the skies over Moscow. It had been so long since the cloud barrier had covered the sky, blocking out the majority of the sunlight, that all over people scarcely knew how to react to it. The morning sun shone brightly on the snow-covered hills as the warmth began to eat away at the crisp white blanket that lay all about. And from the observation deck of the Ice Warrior's floating fortress, Brigadier Stewart watched it all as he rested against the view screen. The long winter was over at last. His original directive was completed, and yet here he still was, stuck aboard an alien spacecraft. Typical. The Brigadier lowered himself down onto a cold iron step and rested his arms on his knees, letting a deep sigh escape his anxious lungs. Mankind's future would be decided any moment now, and here he was looking out at the view like a helpless civilian. Alistair had always made it his mission not to be helpless, not to be one of the endless rows of faces his men held back at barricades over sensitive sites, but there was little more he could do at this point. The Doctor had made his decision, and there was no arguing with that man, let alone arguing against the universal laws of engagement or whatever that old fool had called them. Just then he turned his head as the Doctor walked onto the deck, running his hands back through his thin, wiry hair and scratching the side of his head. The Brigadier looked at him, one of his oldest friends. He barely recognized the man, and not just from the regeneration. Everything about this Doctor was different from those he had known before, and he wasn't completely sure whether it was an entirely good change. Rubbing his weary hands against his eyes, the Doctor glanced up and spotted him, crossing the room and plopping himself down on the steps next to him. "Not long to go now, eh, Doctor?" Stewart began, looking at the Time Lord. The Doctor glanced at him for the briefest moment with that distant, faraway gaze before looking to the floor. "I do hope you have a plan, old boy." "I'm not completely sure that I do," the Time Lord admitted, tenting his fingers in front of his face. "I knew challenging him to a duel would force him to halt all action against the planet, but I was rather hoping his better nature would have kicked in by now." The Brigadier chuckled to himself. "I think you may be referring to a better human nature that a Martian warlord is not entirely capable of, Doctor," he joked. "I met Skaldak a long time ago, Alistair," the Doctor said, "and when I did I was certain he would stop at nothing to destroy this world, but he didn't." He paused for a moment, staring out the view screen at the world beyond. "Now the tables are turned, and I'm not sure I can convince him to spare it." "You'll find a way, old chap," Stewart assured him, and the Doctor glanced at him again. "What makes you so sure?" he asked. Alistair smiled and put his hand on the Doctor's shoulder. "Because we need you to." He smiled. The Doctor turned away again. The Brigadier saw that sadness lurking at the back of his eye, and this time it was too much. One more faraway glance than he could tolerate. He looked at the floor, taking a few deep breaths, pondering how to word his next question. He knew what he had to ask, but he was uncertain of how to ask it, as he'd never had to ask a question like it in all his long days. With a gulp he looked straight ahead and spoke very calmly and smoothly. "I'm dead, aren't I?" The Doctor looked around to him. "Nah, you'll be all right, Brigadier," he assured him. "Whatever happens, I'll make sure nothing happens to you." The Brigadier didn't alter his gaze. "That's not what I meant, Doctor," he said slowly, turning to look his friend straight in the eye. "I meant I'm dead in your time." The Doctor paused and heaved himself up, wandering to the view screen and resting his arms on a thin iron railing. "Everyone's dead in my time, Alistair, and no one's been born yet," he explained. "It's no way to look at life, and believe me, I've tried." The Brigadier rose to his feet and stood alongside him. "Well, no, but it's happened, hasn't it?" he asked. The Doctor let out a deep sigh and hung his head. "How could you tell?" he replied slowly. Stewart straightened himself up. "It wasn't a difficult deduction to make, Doctor," he said calmly. "You've barely held eye contact with me since you arrived, and when you do there's a sadness in your eye that I've never seen before, like looking at a photograph of a long-lost relative." "Or a friend," the Doctor said quietly. "I'm sorry, Alistair. I don't know how it happened. Normally events line up and I never receive any contact from, well, people who have departed in my lifetime. But when you sent out the call, somehow it must have gotten confused in the vortex, arrived too late in my timeline. I was having this conversation with..." He paused for a moment before admitting, "Myself, the other day. I've always made it a rule never to go back to someone after I've lost them, but not you. I couldn't ignore a call for help from my best friend." Stewart smiled at him. Then he turned to look out the window, suddenly feeling the finality of his life, as though the countdown to that day had finally made itself audible to his ears. He bit the corner of his lip, but soon felt a warm hand on his shoulder. "There's no pain, old friend. It's a quiet, dignified, and peaceful end many years after retirement." "What a relief," Stewart sighed. "What about UNIT? Without me, it'd be overrun by the military. I've only just managed to get everything under control at command." The doctor smiled. "Don't worry about UNIT, it's in very good hands." He smiled. Stewart peered through the window and felt a smile creep across his face. "Kate," he said quietly. The doctor turned to him. "What was that?" "Nothing." The other doctor held himself upright as he stood before his elder counterpart and held out his hand, which the doctor took with a smile. "Now you're sure you don't need me to stay?" the other doctor asked, but the doctor shook his head. "Of course, probably dissolving a star system somewhere just by being here. I should probably start writing apologies to neighbouring worlds." The doctor pondered for a moment. He had always wondered where that stack of unsent envelopes on the lower deck of the TARDIS had come from. "Thank you for all your help," he smiled, and his younger self smiled back, as he realised something. There was a light in this doctor's eye that his later incarnations were sorely lacking. That small shimmer of innocence that no doctor since would ever know again. It was all ahead of him. He had no idea what was coming. The doctor placed his other hand over their shake. "Best of luck to you. Stay strong, Doctor." The other doctor peered at him curiously, before giving a polite nod and turning away, taking Stewart's hand. "Brigadier, wonderful to see you again," he said, and Stewart smiled back as the other doctor faced his elder self once more. "Well, it's been nice to meet me," the doctor tutted loudly. "Oh, can we not do the personal pronoun thing this time?" he muttered. "It wasn't funny the first time." The other doctor smiled and stepped back inside his machine, taking one last look behind him. "Yes, perhaps you're right," he chuckled. "I'll be you later," he smirked, disappearing behind the wooden door before the doctor could protest again. And all of a sudden the ancient engines of the time machine began to heave and fall once again as the tall blue box faded from the plane, with the sound of the universe echoing all around it. The doctor sighed, turning to the Brigadier. "I'll never understand how two of you can be in the same place at once," he said slowly. The doctor smiled to himself, and then froze on the spot, his eyes lighting up suddenly as he tossed an idea back and forth in his mind, evaluating every possible outcome and reaching a conclusion, allowing himself a slight smile as he turned to his old friend. "Well, I guess it's time." Skaldak stood atop the upper deck of his warship, his emerald armour glistening in the morning light. His breathing crackled and heavy between those hideous fangs, and hanging in the air as a steady, steamy mist. He watched with delight as his doomed opponent slowly scaled the steps of the deck, one grated step at a time, with each one echoing around the room like the beat of a funeral march. He stood across from the Time Lord, glaring down at him through his thick red visor, growling beneath his helm. "You may select your weapon, Doctor," he hissed, as a large tray of vicious-looking sonic weaponry was lowered out onto the deck from above. The Doctor eyed them all. Pulse cannons and phase rifles, even a reverberating sonic lance and the singing blade of Titan. But as he turned away, he reached his hand into his coat pocket and drew his trusted screwdriver. Skaldak growled furiously. "You dare insult me with that pitiful toy?" "I believe Martian law states I may use any form of sonic tech as my utility of choice," the doctor queried. Skaldak huffed angrily and extended his arm. With a loud clanking noise, a large weapon began to unfold from his armour, extending out to its full length as the sonic cannon sat weightlessly in his grip, its sights trained directly at the Time Lord. But the doctor held up his finger. If memory serves, first the opposing warriors must bow as a sign of mutual respect." He held out his arms, folding one foot behind the other as he bowed his head down. Skaldak simply gazed at him,
I have no respect to show you, Time Lord, he growled. Now perish!
Skaldak lunged forward with his cannon arm, hurling a bolt of sonic energy across the arena, barely dodged by the Doctor as he dashed off to one side to avoid it. The Time Lord rolled across the floor and came to a halt, clutching his shoulder and groaning a little. He wasn't as young as he used to be. He couldn't stop for long, hearing the clanking thuds of Skaldak's armor trudging across the deck as the Ice Warrior gripped him tightly by the collar and flung him into the ceiling with a loud thud. The Doctor quickly reached out in mid-air and caught the iron girder above the deck, heaving himself up as quickly as he could. But before he can get his footing, another howling wave of energy was blasted from the Ice Warrior's cannon, crashing through the supports and bringing the entire metal structure and the Time Lord crashing to the deck. The Doctor struggled to heave the massive iron girder off himself, his eyes darting to see Skaldak closing in one deliberate step at a time. The Time Lord wriggled himself free and crawled beneath the wreckage, jumping at the sudden roar of the Ice Warrior and the violent clanging as he hurled the girders aside. The Doctor moved to dart across the room, but Skaldak reached out and gripped the hem of his coat. With an elegant twirl, the Time Lord slipped free of it and stood across from his foe. He glanced down at his dusty burgundy waistcoat and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small fob watch and holding it to his ear. Broken again. The Doctor did not raise his head. Instead, merely his eyes glanced up to stare down the mighty Ice Warrior. The Time Lord had had enough. As Skaldak lunged forward, the Doctor took an evasive step to the right and spun his screwdriver between his fingers, holding it straight up in his hand and slamming his thumb down on the switch. The screwdriver buzzed triumphantly, interrupted by a sudden clanking, grinding and whining from Skaldak's armor. The joints began to seize up, spark, grinding to a slow but steady halt. The Ice Warrior spun clumsily on his heel, looking down to his armor and desperately trying to understand the alarming readings flashing up on the inside of his visor. His weapon arm was still free, and he raised it, hearing the hum of the sonic cannon preparing to fire. The Doctor smiled, his eyes still low and serious. "Oh, I wouldn't do that," he warned.
What have you done to me?
Skaldak demanded. The Doctor folded his arms behind his back and walked across the room to his scrunched-up coat on the floor. There was a fresh tear in the hem from where the warrior had gripped it in his armoured fingers. "Oh, I think you know," he continued, picking up his coat and shaking it off, a cloud of dust forming in the air around it as he immediately regretted his decision, sliding it onto his arms one by one as he spoke. "When my screwdriver completed its understanding of your technology, it did a bit of extra homework on you, your armor in particular. You'll be able to move, just not very much, and as for that weapon of yours, I think you'll find it most useless. Just like all weapons, all useless in the end. Except yours has been forcibly overridden. Any attempt to fire it and the feedback could overload your armor's life support systems."
You coward!
The Ice Warrior growled.
Face me like a warrior!
The Doctor glared at him fiercely. "I'm not a warrior, Skaldak. I never was," he said clearly. "I'm a doctor. I don't fight, I help people. Look, I'm sorry for what happened to you. I would be lying if I said I didn't feel at least partially responsible for your predicament. But coming here, trying to destroy this planet, it's not the way to get your life back." Skaldak struggled to move and growled loudly.
It is the only way to get my life back,
he bellowed. "Not anymore. Let me show you another way," the Doctor corrected him. "I can take you back, Skaldak, back to Mars." The Ice Warrior stammered a little. Behind his visor, his eyes thinned. "I have a time machine. I can take you back to a time after you became trapped in the ice shelf. I can take you home."
But there would be two of me in the same time. That is impossible,
the Ice Warrior argued. "True, but your other self would be frozen on Earth," the Doctor explained. "And he'll stay trapped there until long after your natural lifespan, keeping the paradox in check. Tell me, Skaldak, would you like to see your daughter again?" The Ice Warrior froze, his maw set slightly ajar, staring back at his enemy. "You can spend the rest of your life with her, an honoured hero of Mars once again. You'll never have been banished, and you can go home at last."
Why would could you do this for me?
Skaldak asked slowly.
I am your enemy. I tried to destroy Earth. I tried to kill you. Why would you help me?
The doctor smiled and straightened his collar. Because I'm the doctor, he announced proudly. I see a creature in need and I just can't help myself. I was put in this universe to help people and that's what I'm going to do. So please, Skaldak, let me help you. The doctor held out his hand and Skaldak stared at it. Then his teeth gritted and he hissed violently.
You're lying to me,
he growled.
You're trying to deceive me again, just like before.
No, Skaldak, please, listen to me, the doctor said desperately as the Ice Warrior began to fight against his armor, causing sparks to fly all around.
I will not! I listened to you before, and you destroyed my life!
Skaldak roared furiously.
A creature in need. You would look down on me like an injured child. I do not ask for your help, Doctor. I do not want your promises and your lies.
The sonic cannon let out a low hum and began to glow. The doctor glanced down to it and his eyes widened as he fumbled in his pocket for his screwdriver. No, Skaldak, don't! He cried.
All I want from you is your life!
The Ice Warrior let out a furious roar and flung his arm up, clenching his fists. The bolt of energy launched from the cannon but stopped almost immediately, as though striking an invisible wall. Then it surged back up Skaldak's armoured arm. With a violent howl, the sonic wave tore through his armour, shattering it like glass, flinging the massive warrior across the deck and slamming him violently against the railing as the rest of his armour broke open like an egg. Wires lay strewn across the floor, and fluids dribbled from the broken body, running across the grated floor and dripping through to the levels below, as circuits let out their final sparks and died all over. The doctor walked slowly across the floor, taking steady and cautious steps, wary still of the mighty warrior which lay before him, broken on the ground, propped up by the decimated railing. Skaldak's armour was hanging open like an unfinished building, and as the doctor stood over him, he saw the slender green alien within lying motionless at the centre of the carnage, its thin arms limp and its neck off at an impossible angle. The ancient Time Lord sighed deeply, bowing his head before turning on his heel and walking away.